Welcome to the first Museum of Art program for the year 2021. I'm Frank Goodyear, co-director of the museum, and I hope that you and your family are staying well during this challenging period. We don't have an update to share about when the museum will reopen to the public, but we will certainly look forward to reopening as soon as it is safe to do so. In the meantime, the team at the museum continues to work with faculty and students and have developed several new strategies for making our collections available during this period of remote learning. Please check out the museum's website for more information about these online resources. We have also been busy continuing the work that the museum is known for, namely planning exhibitions, organizing programming, conducting research, and making acquisitions, among other things. This afternoon, it's wonderful to gather to unveil, at least virtually, a few of the works that have been added to the museum's collection in the last year. As many of you know, the museum takes great pride in a collection that includes artworks from around the globe and made over the past 5,000 years. Guided by a strategic collecting plan, a collections committee, and the council of faculty and the museum's curatorial staff, we continue to fill gaps in that collection. We are very grateful for the generosity of alumni and other friends who have presented works to the museum over the past year, and to those who have established endowments that allow the museum to purchase works for the collection. To all of you, thank you so much. I'm joined this afternoon by three colleagues: Sean Burrus, the museum's Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow; Elizabeth Humphrey, class of 2014, the Curatorial Assistant and Manager of Student Programs; and Collins Goodyear, my fellow co-director and dear wife. Each of us will speak this evening about two artists whose work has recently been added to the collection. At the end, there will be time for questions, and you're welcome to submit them using the Q&A function. Also, please note that closed captioning is also available and that we will be posting a recording of this program on the museum's website in the next week or so. We've decided to proceed in a chronological fashion, which means that we will start with Sean's thoughts about the most recent addition to the museum's outstanding antiquity collection. With that, Sean, take it away.
Thanks, Frank. And it's really great to have this opportunity to virtually share some of our new acquisitions with you all at home. The first piece I want to share with you today is, as Frank mentioned, the oldest we're going to look at. It's a Greek funerary stele that dates to the Hellenistic period, from the 2nd century before the Common Era. It's an important addition to the antiquities collection at the museum, our first piece of Greek funerary sculpture in the collection, and a really compelling work in its own right. Now, Greek funerary stelae are one of the most familiar and recognizable forms of ancient sculpture. They're a testament not only to the achievements of Greek sculptors, but as funerary objects, as memorials, they bear witness to Greek culture and society, as well as to individual Greek lives. Their intimacy and immediacy gives us a kind of unparalleled access to the ancient world, and it holds out the possibility of imagining ourselves into the past in very powerful ways. This particular stele takes the form of what is known as a pedimental naiskos. In other words, it replicates the form of a small temple in Greek classical form, a naiskos, crowned with a pediment. And so its architectural details are one interesting aspect for educational use. The pedimental naiskos form was one of the most popular and most accessible styles of Greek funerary monuments, which during the Hellenistic period became increasingly available beyond the elite classes. This availability went hand in hand with a great flourishing in individualized portrait sculpture among Greek sculptural workshops. And here we can see a prime example of Hellenistic portrait sculpture. Carved below the pediment is a really touching, poignant scene of two brothers saying a final graveside goodbye. Now we can infer that the pair are brothers not only from their similar features, their similar hair, and their shared simple Greek clothing, but also from the way that they clasp hands. This is an important gesture known as dexiosis and was reserved in antiquity for indicating close family bonds. Now, unfortunately, we can't know which of the two brothers is the deceased and which is the brother who commissioned this stele. We at the museum have our suspicions based on the postures and heights and other little attributes, but there's no way of knowing in the absence of the original inscriptions, which probably would have been painted in red below the figures. We invite you at home to make your own guesses as to who's who in this stele. To conclude this object, I'll make just a few observations very briefly about the exciting ways this stele fits in with the collection at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. In the first case, as the first Greek funerary sculpture in the collection, the stele joins a collection rich in funerary objects like vases, figurines, and jewelry. But these are the types of funerary artifacts that would have been deposited underground at the time of burial. So it's wonderful to have this stele and to be able to anchor our grave goods in a representative example of the type of monument that ancient Greeks would have encountered above ground. On the other hand, the stele joins an antiquities collection that is rich already in ancient portraiture, offering a new and Hellenistic example to a collection full of Roman imperial portraits, Assyrian kings, Egyptian mummy masks, and Fayum panel paintings. Lastly, as some of you may know, the core of the BCMA Antiquities collection is owing to the generosity of the American collector Edward Perry Warren, who donated over 500 antiquities to the museum in the early 20th century. Now, as a collector, Warren was deeply interested in themes of Greek and Roman masculinity and brotherly love. And we think that this is an object that Warren would have been quite taken with himself had he encountered it. Moving on, and a little closer to the world of today, I'm delighted to be able to share with you a painting that provides a glimpse into the culture of Northern Europe in the early modern period, and it's really a fascinating record of early modern medical practice. This painting of a doctor's surgery by the Dutch painter Egbert van Heemskerk the Elder is a major gift to the museum by the children of Dr. Bernard and Miss Jeanette Gordon Halperin in honor of their parents. I'd be remiss if I didn't also express our gratitude at this point to George Keyes, a member of the museum's advisory council and the former curator of European paintings at the Detroit Institute of Art, who has generously shared his expertise on many occasions and whose keen insights into this work have shaped our understanding of this exciting new addition to the collection. In this scene, Van Heemskerk captures an emergency surgery to save a man who is clearly at death's door, an event that unfolds before the viewer much as a scene from a play. More on that in a moment. The painting is chock full of details, each more dramatic or curious than the next. The patient, chest bared and slumped over in a chair at the center of the composition, is being bled and probed by a local surgeon. Now, this surgeon is a type of stock character, and his disheveled appearance does very little to inspire confidence. Indeed, he's one of several elements that lend a satirical air to a painting that is at odds with what is otherwise a dramatic event. Arrayed around this unfolding drama, very much like actors on a stage, are several groupings of waiting patients in various degrees of distress, and a trio of onlookers who we can see here, who crowd over the doctor's shoulders, gazing with obviously or patently obvious morbid curiosity at the action at hand. To the right of this central scene, a woman covers her face in fear or in grief, an exaggerated outpouring of emotion that is in, again, satirical contrast with the man standing over her, who adopts a rather blasé attitude about the whole affair. Notable elements of the painting that we can see in this inset are several vanitas symbols, including the niche at the right with the skull, a drawing of a bird, and a glass bottle, below which is an extinguished candle. This little grouping forms something of a painting within a painting, and one that suggests a pessimistic appraisal of the surgeon's skill and the patient's fate. A last detail, a little Easter egg before we return to the painting as a whole. Hanging from the rafters of the doctor's surgery are two groupings of exotic fish, the larger of which is a sawtooth shark. I've lightened the image here so you can make out the detail. Now, similar dried creatures can be found in many genre paintings, and they lend a whiff of the exotic to otherwise everyday scenes. They're a reminder that in this period, the Dutch Golden Age, the Netherlands was at the center of a thriving and far-reaching network of trade. Returning to the painting as a whole, we have here one of several genre scenes of a medical theme that were painted by Egbert van Heemskerk the Elder. The son of a Harlem doctor, Van Heemskerk returned to the theme more than a dozen times over the course of his career, and his early upbringing in a doctor's household likely accounts for his interest into the subject matter and the keen insight and skill with which he rendered medical details. Heemskerk spent the latter half of his life, from 1675 on, in England. There, his paintings represented something new and novel to English patrons, and he was popular among the English nobility and the upper classes for his portraits and lively scenes. He even worked for a time at the court of King Charles II. But this scene is remarkable not only as an early modern medical drama. I've alluded to a few details already that lend a theatrical air to the tableau. As George Guise observed, the arrangement of characters in discrete and dramatic groupings around the central drama, the exaggerated gestures and extreme pathos of the figures, and the perspective of the viewer, for whom this box-like interior and its occupants are arranged much like a stage, all suggest that Heemskerk, like many other genre painters, was inspired and may have participated in the amateur theatrical companies that were popular in Dutch communities of the period. Genre painting, lively, whimsical, humorous, and sometimes bawdy scenes of everyday life, from tavern interiors to market scenes, enjoyed widespread popularity in Northern Europe in the 17th century, and Netherlandish artists were recognized as the foremost practitioners of the form. Medical scenes, including apothecaries, deathbeds, and early surgeries such as this one's, are one of the rarer and, to my mind, especially fascinating subject matters depicted by genre painters. And so we are very enthusiastic about the addition of this painting to the collection and in being able to share this previously unrepresented form with our audiences. Frank, I'll pass the mic back over to you.
Sean, thank you. That's terrific. On the screen now is the first of two objects that I'm going to speak about. This print, Alexander von Humboldt in his library, a chromolithograph from 1856. I want to begin by noting that it is being donated to the museum by Earl Shuttleworth, the Maine State historian, and a 2008 Bowdoin honorand. Earl is making this gift in honor of Christopher Monkhouse, a dear friend of the museum who sadly passed away earlier this month. Christopher had a distinguished career as a museum curator in Minneapolis and Chicago before retiring to Brunswick several years ago. Like von Humboldt, Christopher was a great researcher, had a large library, and collected objects and artworks throughout his life. He will be greatly, greatly missed. Returning to the work at hand, the print shows the celebrated 87-year-old scientist seated in the library of his Berlin home. The objects represented in the print reflect a lifetime of research and travel. In addition to a huge quantity of books, there are stuffed animals, framed artworks and sculptures, a globe, and a long table littered with books, papers, and rolled maps. Humboldt sits in his chair, directing his gaze at the artist and holding a group of papers in his hand that he was obviously in the midst of reading. Who was Alexander von Humboldt? From the late 18th century to 1859, the year of his death, von Humboldt was one of the most influential scientists and admired thinkers of his age. Born in Berlin in 1769, he was a world traveler who conducted research on 4 continents. During his lifetime, he wrote more than 36 books and 25,000 letters to a network of correspondents around the globe. A charismatic figure, von Humboldt epitomized the Enlightenment desire to want to know everything about everything and was instrumental in helping to establish modern scientific methods. He claimed to sleep only 4 hours a night and called coffee, quote, concentrated sunbeams. He claimed to, among his many scientific achievements, von Humboldt theorized the spreading of the continental landmasses through plate tectonics, mapped the distribution of plants on 3 continents, and charted the way air and water move to create bands of climate at different latitudes and altitudes. He observed the relationship between deforestation and changes in local climate, located the magnetic equator, and found fossil remains of both plants and animals that he understood to be precursors to modern life forms, acknowledging extinction and evolution before many others. In the summer of 1804, early in his career, he spent 6 weeks in the United States, his only visit to the United States in his lifetime. But he spent time visiting with President Jefferson at the White House in Washington and with various artists and scientists in Philadelphia, including Charles Willson Peale, who was inspired the very following year to found one of the earliest museums in the United States. Humboldt corresponded with Jefferson for years, and among other things, helped the United States to establish the border between New Spain and the recently acquired Louisiana Territory. By 1856, the year of this print, Humboldt was a revered figure in Europe and the Americas, and often overwhelmed by letters and visitors. At one point, he sent a notice to newspapers in Europe and the United States asking people to cease and desist from writing him. Yet for some visitors, he acquiesced to a visit. When former US President Millard Fillmore traveled to Berlin in 1856 with Washington banker and art collector William Corcoran, they visited Humboldt. On that occasion, Corcoran commissioned a marble bust of Humboldt for his new gallery in Washington, and Fillmore returned home with a copy of this newly created print by the German landscape painter Edvard Hildebrandt. Hildebrandt was a longtime friend of von Humboldt's, who granted him permission to create this image for sale to his admirers. Copies of this chromolithograph in American collections are quite rare. This particular copy has a wonderful history, having originally been in the collection of the Portland Society of Natural History, an institution founded in 1843, whose work was much inspired by Humboldt's example. When the Portland Society was disbanded in the 1970s, its collections were dispersed, and eventually their copy of this print was acquired by Earl. Earl has now decided to place it at Bowdoin. We are thrilled to add this rare print to the museum's outstanding print collection, for it suggests much about 19th century science and the importance of Humboldt's work in Europe and the United States. We are grateful that Christopher's memory will live on at the museum through this wonderful work of art. Earl, thank you so very much. The second work on which I'm going to speak this afternoon is this painted plaster sculpture titled Gammon by Augustus Savage. It was donated late last year by Hallie Harrisburg, class of 1990, and her husband, Michael Rosenfeld. Over more than 20 years, Hallie and Michael have donated more than 30 artworks to the museum and have had a special interest in growing the museum's collection of artworks by African-American artists. Their expertise in this field and their generosity to the museum is much, much appreciated. And this newest gift is absolutely tremendous. Simply put, Gammon is regarded as one of the most iconic sculpture of the Harlem Renaissance. Created early in Savage's career, it is her best known work and emblematic of the artist's commitment to capturing empathetically the likenesses of African-American individuals. For this sculpture, Savage employed a classical form, the portrait bust, that has typically been reserved for the privileged and the powerful throughout history. In Gammon, Savage challenged and updated this tradition. In French, Gammon refers to a street urchin, or more generally, a kid. Some scholars suggest that Savage's subject was inspired by a homeless boy on the street, while others believed it's based on the artist's nephew, Ellis Ford. Like Savage, Ford resided in Harlem and reportedly gained the nickname Gammon for his spirited, defiant nature. In this sculpture, Savage sensitively modeled her subject in contemporary dress. The figure's wrinkled shirt and cap emphasize his impoverished appearance. His expression is both jaunty and vulnerable, making the child appear wiser and older than he first appears. Through this depiction, Savage poignantly implies the hardship of the boy's experience. This version of Gammon was executed in plaster that Savage painted to simulate bronze, as she did not have the financial resources to produce a series of bronzes. That said, 2 bronze versions of this work do exist, and it was the public exhibition of one of these bronzes that first gained Savage widespread acclaim. The work was so well received at the time that Savage was awarded shortly thereafter in 1929 a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship to fund her studies in Paris. Savage was the first visual artist to receive a fellowship from the Rosenwald Fund, a philanthropic fund that chartered in 1917 to promote opportunities for disadvantaged Americans. It's worth also noting that the sculpture also illustrated the cover of a 1929 issue of the National Urban League's magazine, Opportunity. In addition to working as a sculptor, Savage was a highly respected art teacher and community art program director in Harlem, active from the 1920s through the 1940s. Born and raised in Green Cove Springs, Florida, Savage moved to New York City in 1921 after failing to support herself as a sculptor in Florida. Upon arrival in New York, Savage worked as an apartment caretaker and enrolled at the Cooper Union School of Art. She lived and worked in a small studio apartment, earning a reputation as a portrait sculptor by completing busts of prominent African-American individuals, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Returning to New York in 1932, after 3 years of study abroad, Savage founded the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts in Harlem. She was immediately an influential teacher, becoming the first African-American member of the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors. In 1937, Savage was appointed the first director of the Harlem Community Arts Center and was instrumental in convincing the Works Project Administration, part of FDR's New Deal, to include Black artists in its federal arts program. The exact number of Gammon painted plaster sculptures is not known, but it's estimated to be around 25. This is the first work by Augustus Savage to enter the museum's collection, and we're really excited by the opportunity to share it with faculty and students and to include it in future exhibitions, including, most importantly and most immediately, There is a Woman in Every Color, Black Women in Art, an exhibition that will open at the museum next September. The curator of that exhibition is Elizabeth Humphrey, and I'm happy at this time to turn the stage over to her. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Frank. Hello, everyone. I am delighted to introduce to you 2 new acquisitions of photography. And so the works that I'll present today prompt the following question. What is the relationship between the subject and the room, the subject and the photographer, and the subject to the viewer? And both works provide different answers and approaches to those questions. First, we have a series of 2 cabinet cards by American photographer John B. Wortham, and that's what you see here on the screen. Wortham was born in Tennessee in 1838, lived in Alabama in the early part of his life, and then relocated to Winchester, Virginia after the Civil War. He was a surgeon in the Confederate Army and again remained in Winchester after the war, where these photographs were taken. He seems to have been a prominent photographer, mostly documenting Civil War battle scenes or battle sites, monuments, and scenes around Winchester, Virginia. These undated cabinet cards were likely taken in the late 19th century based on the dress of the individuals pictured and also some records that we've been able to find about the photographer's life. Here we see pictured 3 white children and an older African-American woman nestled between them. This unique double print gives us 2 images to unpack the relationships of the sitters. And it's interesting to compare the different hand placements and levels of closeness between the 2 images on the screen. Their positioning is very intimate and familiar, based on the young girl to the right casually resting against the African-American woman's side. Because these works are undated, it is hard to confirm whether this is a portrait of an enslaved woman or done in the period of Reconstruction. That said, her affiliation with the children leads me to believe that she did spend most of her life enslaved and likely took on the role of wet nurse in the earlier part of her life. If you're not familiar with the practice of wet nursing, wet nurses are generally women who breastfeed and care for another woman's child or children. Wet nursing emerged in the United States as a practice that colonists brought over from Europe. In the southern United States, it was a common practice for enslaved Black women to be forced to provide their milk to their enslavers' children. And to be an enslaved woman who could nurse another's child, this meant that you had to be nursing your own children as well. It was a popular convention to include the wet nurse or the enslaved nanny in photographs taken of the slave owner's children, again, possibly to watch over the children as the photographs were taken. But her inclusion in the photograph also served as a visual record of the enslaver's wealth, status, and property. Despite the inclusion of the Black woman in this nanny children portrait, these photographs are meant to be portraits of the children, likely commissioned by their parents. The photographs capture not only a portrait of the children or even their relationship to the Black caretaker, it also preserves the woman's role as a prop or background device meant to pose in or position the photograph. These photographs were not taken for the benefit of the Black servant or given to her family. So we are left to wonder what life was like for the Black woman, who her loved ones were, and how the image might have circulated without her knowledge. This lack of agency is something that we see contrasted in the next acquisition. The next acquisition, as I mentioned, is a contrast to these 2 cabinet cards. This is Dina Lawson's Sharon, made in 2007. Here we see a woman fully nude and posed confidently in what appears to be a bare room. The woman makes direct eye contact with the viewer, not shying away from her vulnerable appearance. It is interesting to note that this image also bears a strikingly similar composition to a work by William Witt, also a photographer featured in our collection as well. Unlike the cabinet cards and the William Witt photograph, the Black subject is identified, her name appearing as the title of the work, Sharon. Her almost regal presence is juxtaposed by the sparsity of the room, the cheap-looking thin curtains and rumpled plastic blinds. Dina Lawson gave careful attention to the lighting and traditional pose in order to transform the woman's body into an intense expression of power and confidence. This portrait functions differently from the cabinet cards because it is made with the Black woman's identity in mind, not seen as a periphery figure, but the only and most important subject. Lawson's Sharon captures a vision of Black people that Lawson could uniquely access. Born in Rochester, New York in 1979, Dina Lawson's work examines the personal and social histories of her subjects, often exploring themes of familial legacy, community, and Black culture. She often meets her subjects organically, either encountering them on the street, on the subway, and even on road trips. Her ability to relate to her subjects from a level of shared community allows her to use her portraits to document and insert new ways and new views of Black people into American art and their culture, while also countering traditional and historical representations of the Black community. In an interview, Lawson described her work's goal stating, quote, "I want to capture within them something that represents the majesty of Black life, a nuanced Black life, one that is far more complex, deep, beautiful, celebratory, tragic, weird, and strange," end quote. Both of these acquisitions contribute to making our permanent collection more inclusive of diverse histories, specifically contributing to the representation of Black and African American women in American art. And I am excited to see these come out from the collection and into the classroom for study, and of course to see them realized in future and soon to be exhibition project, There Is a Woman in Every Color. With that, I'll turn things over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that illuminating presentation. This evening, it's my pleasure to conclude the formal portion of our program with a presentation of the work of two contemporary artists with close connections to Maine, Farah Alqasimi and Kathleen Bradley. I lead with Farah Alqasimi, whose 5-star barbershop and Woman in Leopard print we are delighted to have recently acquired through the generosity of the Collectors Collaborative, a group of young and young at heart Bowdoin alumni. Farah was born and raised in the United Arab Emirates and is now living and working in New York. She received her BA and MFA degrees from Yale, and in 2017 was part of the summer cohort at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, just up the road from Brunswick. Her work has been exhibited internationally, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Knight Foundation and Wayne State University Grant, an Aaron Siskind Individual Photographers Grant, the Nada Artadia Award, and a Light Work Residency. She is also, it's worth noting, a classically trained pianist and filmmaker. And indeed, we learned that Farah actually did some of her piano training as a child here in Wiscasset. Through her photography, Farah explores the relationship of the individual to society at large, asking implicit questions about the cultural forces that shape our sense of self and how those tensions may affect our own sense of self-identity. The theme is particularly appropriate for the series of which they were a part, Back and Forth Disco. Back and Forth Disco was commissioned by the Public Art Fund in 2019. The works, 4 in total, and including the 2 that we have just acquired, or images thereof, were situated in 100 New York City bus shelters in all 5 boroughs of the city, as indicated by the images on the right. And I'm happy to note that in the upper left of that group of 6 installation pictures, you'll actually see Woman in Leopard print on view as part of this project. The show represented Alqasimi's first institutional exhibition in New York, and the artist has explained that it gave her a new way of thinking about audience. And indeed, while the audience for most inaugural exhibitions normally must seek out the museum, in this instance, Farah has reversed that expectation, taking the works back to the neighborhoods in which they were originally created, and setting up an interactive experience for viewers who might encounter them quite by chance. If the title Back and Forth Disco for the series suggests something about the movement of commuters, it also testifies to something else. I especially like the way in which the musical title, which may evoke Alqasimi's own love of music, also brings to mind an homage to New York created by an earlier artist immigrant to the city, Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie, created after the Dutch artist arrived in the city during World War II. Like Mondrian, Alqasimi's piece plays with the rhythms of the city. But if Mondrian implicitly positioned his audience as relatively passive listeners and viewers, Alqasimi instead transforms them into participants, into dancers of a sort. In so doing, she raises an implicit question. If these individuals, both those pictured and those surrounding them in the neighborhood, are dressed up to perform for one another, just what is exposed and what is deliberately held back? As if emphasizing the question, each of her subjects engaged in primping is seen from behind and shown through the agency of mirrors. We seem to be glimpsing something hidden, a moment of unanticipated self-exposure, and therefore simultaneously raising the specter of unwelcome surveillance. The act of looking is emphasized by the eye visible as the woman in the leopard print glimpses herself furtively. Indeed, even her leopard skin print pattern suggests simultaneously a desire both to stand out for her glamour as well as to camouflage herself. To what degree then is this back and forth less a matter of transportation and more about the internal rhythms of human life in the 21st century? Intriguingly, if these pieces were made only slightly over a year ago, in 2019, they also reveal a moment when it was still normal for New Yorkers, and indeed the rest of us, to be out and about in the hubbub of public, putting ourselves out there to see and be seen. Nowadays, such an experience seems to be lost in nostalgia. And on that note, I turn to Kathy Bradford's Fear of Dark, created last summer, which brings us closer to the present moment. And while the period of its making reflects a moment of necessary physical distancing, we were happily able to see the painting this summer in person with the artist and are deeply grateful to David and Barbara Rue for generously helping us to add it to the museum's permanent collection. Well known to many members of this audience, Kathy Bradford splits her time between New York and Brunswick, Maine, and is celebrated for her bold, colorful canvases, many of which evoke quasi-dreamscapes, often associated with rich metaphorical overtones. She has received awards from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and the Pollock Krasner Foundation, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And her work has been widely exhibited and collected at leading institutions. Painted here in Brunswick during the summer of 2020, Fear of Dark is part of a group of artworks playfully known as lap sitters that developed over the past summer. The first in this series, a small gouache at the upper right of your screen, took shape during the artist's quarantine upon returning to Maine in the early spring of 2020. What was originally intended as a painting of 3 people, perhaps evoked by the artist's thinking about her 2 adult children who were in regular touch with her, checking in on her at the time, became a painting of 3 people sitting on a lap. As Kathy ruminated over what she had created, she thought, maybe that's just where we want to be, on a mother's lap, a place of comfort. As one critic has noted, the sitter in the chair of that gouache actually merges with the site on which she sits. And indeed, it is interesting that in the very language we use to describe chairs, they do merge with the human body. We speak, for example, of the legs and the back and the arms of chairs. And just as chairs provide support by their very nature, perhaps the nurturing people we become reflects the nurturing environments we occupy. The small work on paper, Lap Sitters, inspired Kathy to create larger paintings. And in the lower portion of the screen, I share with you a screenshot taken from a wonderful video by Kathy describing this series of paintings available on the website of Canada, her gallery. In this painting, we see the imagery of an expanded mother's lap. 2 people sit there already, and a 3rd prepares to jump on. Musing on the work, Kathy noted, "It seems to me that if you go and sit on someone's lap for a little while, that eventually you will be the one to provide the lap. Thus, the person who seeks comfort may eventually be the one to provide it." Returning to our fear of dark, I cannot help but think of childhood fears of the dark, the specters and spooks that grow out of our uncertainty about what we don't know, precisely the thing for which we seek a parent's comfort. I am grateful to Kathy for sharing her own reflections on this canvas in a recent email exchange. Turning away from the fears of childhood, Kathy turned instead to the concerns of adulthood. And she noted, the title, Fear of Dark, grew out of my belief that not only were we fearful of the future, which newscasters had termed dark, but that there was also an intense racial divide and protests for Black Lives Matter going on all summer. But even as we turn our attention to these solemn challenges and contemplate the difficult uncertainties that darkness may convey, the painting also, to my mind, brings to mind points of brightness that may emerge during darkness, just as commitments seem to eke their way as we ruminate on what is not yet known. In the same way that stars seem to shine and be present in this canvas, this may in turn serve as a reminder that the best antidote for fear of dark is to shine light on that which seems puzzling or foreign, to confront it and to move forward. And on that note, it intrigues me that the sitter at the foundation of the group seems, to me at least, to be the youngest, certainly the smallest figure, with feet well grounded, indeed deeply planted into the ground of the painting. Might there be a sense in which we are reminded that it is not just children who are comforted by adults, but us adults who may become comforted by the commitment of children and the young to change and to the visions they may craft and shape of the future. Finally, I note that Bradford's figures, created in a time of uncertainty and physical separation, are tightly fused, a powerful reminder of the ongoing importance of community and connectedness, perhaps more so today than ever. And we are indeed reminded of the power of our own community. We are grateful to you for joining us this evening virtually. We certainly look forward to the time when we can once again come together in person, but we are glad to be connected now electronically with this wonderful opportunity to continue to share and be inspired by art. And on that note, we'd now like to open the floor to your questions, to hear your reflections, and to continue the conversation as a community.
If you have a question, please post it in the using the Q&A function on Zoom. Ann and I are happy to moderate conversation for the next 10 minutes or so, and might invite Sean and Elizabeth to join us as well.
And I might actually take advantage of a speaker's prerogative to begin the question and answers with a question for my colleague, Elizabeth Humphrey. One of the fun parts of presentations like this is that they, I think, give each of us at the museum an opportunity to think in new ways about artworks that we have recently brought into the collection. And Elizabeth, as you were speaking about the photograph of John Wortham, one of the things that I started to think about, which intrigued me, is that it is yet another depiction of this act of lap sitting and perhaps comfort. And I wondered whether or not you might have any further ruminations, in addition to those that you shared earlier, about the nature of family, comfort, and perhaps even special form of connectedness that is reflected in that photograph, or if you would be interested in taking that in another direction.
Sure. So when I think about photographs of this particular convention, and by convention I'm thinking of the inclusion of the Black nanny or wet nurse with the infant children that are in her charge, there is this sort of convention of portraying gentility and family and connection. And so you do often see these images of these enslaved nannies sort of holding the children in their arm or placing them on their lap. And there is certainly a functional quality to that. You know, children have wiggly bodies, and for long exposure cameras, it's helpful to keep them as still as possible. But I do think that there is a level of trying to display a reality that is not quite true. I think it is trying to express a level of connection and familiarity that is certainly there, but I would urge us to call that into question, although that connection is certainly there and that intimacy is certainly founded. We need to call into question the structures that put that intimacy into being in the first place. And so when I look at these images, sure, they read in some ways a level of comfort or familiarity. But again, I think of the other side of that coin, which is the forced level of interaction, having no choice but to care for these children because you have no agency over your own life and the work that you do. And so I could certainly read comfort and familiarity into this, but I would take a more critical lens when contextualizing the history behind it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Sean, I wanted to pose a question to you about the Greek stele. I'm wondering, how rare are, extant examples of these marble funerary stele? And I'm wondering, about the route that this work has taken since the time of its creation to now ending up here on the shores of Maine.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. First, let me just really quickly observe that this is also an intimate scene. It's not a lap sitting per se, but I like the connection that we've all kind of talked about, works that show some level of intimacy. But like Elizabeth's work, this intimacy here is very much governed by a convention, and it's also a fiction because this deceased brother can't really be grasped, and it's an imaginary embrace in a way. The rarity of these stele. So on the one hand, these stele are incredibly common. We encounter them in museum collections across the world. They are some of the most common forms of Greek sculpture that are encountered. But on the other hand, it's incredibly rare to find intact surviving examples. They were used, they were often taken and reused from the Byzantine period up to the early modern period in buildings across what was once the Greek world, across the ancient Mediterranean. So finding one that is more or less intact is incredibly rare. And you asked the question about the journey that this stele has taken to reach us here in Brunswick. And it is actually a very interesting history or provenance that I'll just share really briefly about because I see we're getting some more questions in the queue. The stele first appeared in the gallery of Brimo de la Rousseau. And Brimo de la Rousseau was a major European gallerist of the day. And from there, it was acquired by Joseph Brummer. Joseph Brummer was an equally prominent dealer. And the interesting thing about Joseph Brummer is that he dealt in both ancient and contemporary art. And he moved his gallery from Paris to New York in 1921. And his stele was one of the first, and this stele was one of the first pieces on offer in his New York gallery. That New York gallery played a very important role in promoting modern art in New York, but also in popularizing ancient works of art as well. The stele went into the collection of Mina Merrill Prindle for decoration of the Prindle estate in Duluth, Minnesota in 1930. And we're looking forward to researching more about how the piece was displayed in that context. I think it's really interesting to think about the appeal that this piece might have had to sort of a Midwestern female collector in the early 20th century, when so much of our collection was formed by a New England collector at the same time, Edward Perry Warren.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I want to turn now to a question from the audience. Coco, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Coco Kim noticed that during a recent visit to New York, that a work by Martine Gutierrez has now joined the collection of the Bowdoin Museum. I'm very interested in her work and would like to know which one of you acquired it and how it fits into the collection. I'm going to turn the floor in a moment over to Frank, but it is another example of an artwork brought in by the Collectors Collaborative and a piece that we're absolutely thrilled to have recently added. Frank, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, what's interesting about collecting at the Museum of Art is that with a collection that's global in scope and transhistorical, we are looking at so many different things and have a particular eye towards more recent contemporary work. Martine Gutierrez is a really interesting transgender artist from the United States who dresses up in all sorts of different gender-bending costumes that evoke all sorts of wonderful mythological fantasies. And just last year, we encountered her work with the collaborative during a visit to the Ryan Lee Gallery in Chelsea in New York, and acquired a work called Demons, Eater of Filth, from a portfolio called Indigenous Woman. It's a tremendously exuberant picture. It's got a wonderful painted frame, and it was just something that we knew right away that confronted some really, I think, timely issues about gender and identity that are so important on college campuses and beyond these days. And so it's was great to see this work with a host of Bowdoin alums, and to recognize, given their enthusiastic response to the piece, that this was clearly something we should add to the museum's collection. And we thank them for their support of the collaborative that helped make acquisitions like that possible.
We are We are immensely grateful to everybody who has joined us this evening. And we are delighted to hear from our friend and Collectors Collaborative member, Sarah Hames, who has been an incredibly terrific force. And in fact, it is to Sarah that we owe our acquaintance with Farah Alqasimi. And we are grateful to each and every one of you who has been able to join us this evening. It's great fun to be able to share some of our recent acquisitions. We can't wait to get you back to the museum so you can see these in person. And on that note, we do hope that in the meantime, you'll have an opportunity to join us on many occasions for upcoming programming. We have a wonderful, robust program ahead for the spring. And our next event will take place on Wednesday, the 17th of February at 4:30 p.m. with the artist and scholar Justin Thompson, who will discuss with us his current project on being present, recovering Blackness in the Uffizi Galleries, which highlights the histories and historical context of African figures in the museum's paintings and sculptures. And before we close tonight, I want to extend a warm thanks to each of my colleagues, to Sean, to Elizabeth, and to Frank for their remarks, as well as to our colleagues, Suzanne Bergeron and Leslie Bird, for their support behind the scenes. We very much look forward to seeing you in the near future online. And please do not hesitate to reach out. We can't wait to see you, we hope, later this year in person. Wishing you all a wonderful evening. Take care and be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.